today you will be with me in paradise. I remember back when I was in seminary, we did something called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. And I spent lots and lots of hours with people in hospital beds, dying, working through their own mortality for perhaps the first time ever. And it seemed like the question I got over and over and over again was, what's going to happen to me tomorrow? Now, they weren't asking me what was going to happen to them tomorrow, like the next day of the week. Most of them knew that that would be their last day. It's probably easy to say, oh, it's going to be great. Jesus has got you, and it's going to be fantastic, and you're going to be in heaven, and there's golden streets, and really great music, and lots of pizza. But the truth is, it's a little bit more difficult answer than that. And that throughout Scripture we hear that after we die, we are asleep. Both in Paul and even in the words of Jesus that we heard just recently in the death of Lazarus, that he was asleep. It reminds me of a time when I was a little kid, probably 8, 9 years old. And I went with my parents somewhere, and I didn't even know where it was. But they had fancy sandwiches that were cut in half with the crust all cut off, and other little weird desserts that I thought were fantastic. And there were a bunch of other kids there, and we went outside and played hide and go seek, and I must have run around for 4 hours. Day moved into night, and we played, and we played, and we played, and I had an absolute blast. I came inside towards the end of the party, and I remember going over to my mom and saying, I am tired. And she said, well, sit here with me for a minute. And then I fell asleep. When I awoke, I was sort of freaked out because all of a sudden I was home in my own bed the next morning. I had no idea what had happened. See, I guess that's probably what it's like. And as Jesus looks over and says, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Falling asleep, being carried by Jesus, the one who loves us. That is paradise. Amen.
The third word comes from John, the 19th chapter. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. As Protestants, I think we have lost some of who we understand Jesus to be because we don't really talk about Mary. Mary shows up at Christmas, in TV specials, and maybe in a Christmas pageant, very pregnant, and uncomfortable, riding a donkey looking for a place to have her baby. She and Joseph find a stable, the baby is born, angels sing, there's a star, shepherds come, wise men visit from the east, somewhere in there there's a little drummer boy, and finally the family flees to Egypt. And then we don't really talk much about Mary again until the next Christmas, when she shows up pregnant, again, riding that same donkey. It all fits very neatly into our liturgy, and then we move on. I'm not really sure why this happens. At times I have thought this was because talking about Mary and honoring her for being the mother of God was entirely too Catholic, and that's big C, Catholic, for some of us Protestants. But what if it's something else? What if we don't talk about Mary because Mary makes us remember that this whole story about Jesus is just really, really messy? Because when we bring Mary back into the story, we have to remember that Jesus was someone's son and not just the Son of God. It was Mary who intimately knew Jesus. It was Mary who felt the pain as she labored in childbirth, and then in the moments after he was born, counted his fingers and his toes. Mary changed his diapers and held his pudgy little hands as he learned to walk. She intuitively knew the difference in his cries. She knew if he was crying out in pain or in fear, knew if he was hungry or cranky and just needed a nap. In Luke's gospel, we read about how Mary's heart raced in a panic when she and Joseph could not find him as they were heading back from Jerusalem. They made a 3-day journey back to find him sitting at the temple. For 3 days, Mary did not know where her son was. And then she hears him say to herself and Joseph that they should have known where he would be. The evangelist of Luke says that Mary and Joseph didn't understand what he was saying to them. But as a parent, I have to tell you that I read between the lines. And I think that Mary understood all too well what happened and didn't appreciate being worried by a smart-aleck teenage boy. In the Gospel of Mark, we read about how some of Jesus' family go to get Jesus while he is preaching because they thought he had lost his fool mind. Was this because Mary had said to her sons, "I'm worried about Jesus. Go get him"? And back to the Gospel of John, it was at the wedding in Cana where Mary tells her son that they have run out of wine. She approached Jesus with expectation that he could fix the disaster of the moment. She settles things with Jesus and then tells the servants with a mother's pride, "Do what he tells you to do." Mary treasured in her heart those times of joy, but she also had recall of all those moments that were painful. And now we read that she is standing near the cross, watching the unthinkable happen, because there's no other place she could possibly be. The time that Jesus walked among humanity on earth may have only been around 33 years, but after Jesus died, Mary is still his mother. So I think that maybe we don't like to talk that much about Mary because she makes us feel uncomfortable. She reminds us that there are people who suffer. There are mothers who watch their children die. She reminds us that there is injustice and innocent people who lose their lives. In our culture, we can separate ourselves from the suffering of other people, from the suffering happening in our world. We can change the channel on the television or the radio. We can choose not to sit with people who are suffering. We can walk away. In like fashion, we have sanitized the stories in the Gospels, the birth narrative, the crucifixion, and even the resurrection, because they're just too messy and too painful. We would prefer to cast these messy stories in an angelic glow like some medieval painting. Everyone looks a little sad, but they're all still pretty clean. We would rather leave out the details that make the stories real. I think Mary is one of those details. Because it's easier to think about the pregnant woman on the donkey waiting to have a baby than a broken woman standing by the cross as she watched her son die the humiliating death of a criminal. When we reclaim the story of Mary, we reclaim the humanity of Jesus. And as we reclaim the humanity of Jesus through the messiness that was his story, we reclaim the humanity of ourselves and the humanity of other people. Amen.
The fourth word is from the book of Mark, the 15th chapter. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he is calling for Elijah. And somebody ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. So there's a movie that came out a couple of years ago, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. The movie itself was okay, but there's a line in it that has stuck with me. The proprietor of this rundown hotel in India has a standard reply when things go bad, and they often are in this movie. He says, in the end, everything will be all right. Everything isn't all right. It's not the end. And I bring that up because growing up, there were two very specific times when I really did not like hearing scripture in church. They occurred on Palm Sunday and today. On Palm or Passion Sunday, I always cringed whenever we as a congregation would shout, crucify him. And I was always saddened beyond words when I heard these last words of Christ as Mark and Matthew record them. And I'd always kind of shut down a little bit whenever it was read. I think part of it is it's hard to remember that sometimes it's hard to remember that Jesus was fully human, that he experienced real pain, that at the end of his life he was truly and utterly alone, naked and dying on the cross, denied by his friends, abandoned by God, his Abba, his dad. And in this pain, he cries out in wonder as to why he has been abandoned. It seems like this is the end, and things are most certainly not all right. And I don't think we can fully know what is happening at this point when essentially God forsakes God. But there are some things about this moment that I have come to believe. I believe that it is at this moment when Christ truly takes on the sin of the world, because what is sin but broken relationships? In distancing himself as far from the Father as possible, Christ takes on all of our sin, takes on all of our brokenness and our selfishness, takes on all the times that we have rejected God so that we might be forgiven. It's not that Christ becomes a sacrifice to an angry God who demands blood. It's that Christ makes himself a sacrifice for us. Christ takes on our sin in order that we might be able to have a relationship with the Father. It's this love that the prophet Isaiah spoke of in the description of the suffering servant. This is the love that is freely given for those who don't deserve it. Jesus was executed partially for proclaiming that he had a special relationship with the Father. that was deemed blasphemous. But in what is accomplished through the cry on the cross, Jesus is revealed as the one who does have a special relationship with the Father and who does represent the ultimate fulfillment of the law and the prophets. But why does Jesus cry out this verse? Why does he cry out the opening lines of Psalm 22? It's a psalm of lament. That's a psalm when things are not all right. It's a psalm wondering where God is and why the psalmist has been made to suffer unjustly. Why this psalm? Partly because the psalm itself is a nice narrative of the events of the Passion, but really it's because Jesus is being made to suffer unjustly. But like the psalmist, Jesus never loses faith. He never believes that this is the end. Jesus never wonders if God exists or not. Jesus instead cries out to God to remember that God is merciful and just, and this situation is anything but merciful or just. As Paul puts it, Jesus, who was without sin, became sin, took on that distance between humans and God so that we would never experience that pain of separation, so that we would never be alone, so that in all that we do and in all we are, Christ is always with us. We can never be separated from God because of the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. Hell is truly a place where we are alone and isolated from God, where we have turned so completely in on ourselves that God is no longer in the picture. And this is what Jesus took on. Jesus went to that place of desolation so that we would never have to. Christ takes on our sin to break down the walls that divide us from God, to tear the veil in the temple, to announce an immediate new way of life for those who believe. It's not something in the far-flung future, but this cry serves to initiate the events that occur immediately afterwards. The earth shakes, the dead rise, the veil in the temple is torn, and the separation between God and humanity is gone. And now I hear you. I was just saying that this is a cry of lament, that it's one of defeat. And it is. Or at least it starts out that way. But what is the one thing that we know about Good Friday? We know that it's not the end. Good Friday is not the end of the story. It's not the end of Jesus. Good Friday is not the end because things are not all right. And God has promised us that in the end, things will be all right. This doesn't mean that we won't experience tragedies. That doesn't mean they don't happen. It doesn't mean that we won't experience pain or suffering or death. It doesn't mean that sin may never win a battle. But it does mean that sin will never win the war. And it is for our sake and because of our sins that Jesus gave himself to isolation and forsakenness. Jesus certainly suffered and ultimately died, and all of us will experience pain and tragedy. But in this cry, we can see the ultimate love of Christ for the world. We see how far God will go in order to maintain a relationship with us. And so when we hear, my God, we should remember that this is not the end. And for that, we can be truly thankful.
God forbid you ever had to walk a mile in his shoes. Because then you really might know what it's like to sing the blues. God forbid you ever had to walk a mile in her shoes. Because Because then you really might know what it's like to have to choose. God forbid you ever had to wake up to hear the news. Because then you really might know what it's like to have to lose. Could just be my station in life, but I doubt it. Lately, I've had this longing, this deep desire, this thirst. I thirst for peace. I thirst for certainty. But all that seems to be around me is uncertainty, doubt, anxiety. It's like the rain falling in a flood. It starts with a gray cloud and the wind begins to pick up. Pretty soon, the whole sky is gray. Conversations begin with, "It looks like rain." And you know it's true. We know it's true. We can count on the weatherman to tell us, but we all intuitively know it anyway. A few drops fall. A few more. And suddenly the drops get bigger and bigger. And the rain keeps falling. Sheets of water begin to block our vision until that's all we can see when we look out is rain. And the rain continues. Is it ever going to stop? The ground beneath our feet is no longer firm. It's turned into mud. And this mud begins to take hold of our feet. That feeling of being stuck, of being trapped, takes over. That hopelessness of not seeing the next move, of not knowing if you'll ever move again. The flood has come. The sheets of water that blocked our vision can no longer preoccupy our minds because the water has pooled around our stuck feet. The water rises, and it rises, and it rises, and it rises until it's over our head. God, I'm stuck in this flood. My feet are paralyzed. Where can I go to escape the waves that keep crashing into me? How can I escape this torment, this pain, this suffering? Hear my cries. I long for relief. I long for salvation from this pit of hell. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. But you'll never understand. You'll never know what it's like. How could you ever know what it's like? We hear the fifth word. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. Amen.
Our sixth word comes from John chapter 19. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Is this it, Lord? Is this the end of your work? No. No. It can't be. It can't be. This is not how the King of Kings, the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Messiah, is supposed to die. You said you came down from heaven not to do your own will, but to do the will of the one who sent you. You said you came to do the work of God, but you are not done. You came to do the will of the Father. The will of the Father does not include abandoning those who the Father loves. The will of the Father does not include leaving when there still is so much to do. You healed many people. You taught your disciples. You forgave the unrighteous. You even brought people back from the dead. You did all these things, but we have not personally seen it. We are still waiting for our turn. How can you say it is finished? How can you say that your work is complete? If your work is complete, then why do we have loved ones who are still sick? They still need to be made whole, Lord. You have yet to heal them. Your completed work has to include them. We have broken relationships that need mending. We have war all over this world. We have addictions that need to be overcome. We have lonely people that need comfort. We see poor and suffering people on a daily basis who still need you. We are not finished, so how can you be? No. No. This is not the way it is supposed to end. We need you to do more work. You have not solved our problems. So you can't be finished, Lord. You are King of Kings. You are supposed to bring us a kingdom where there is no more pain. A triumphant kingdom. A perfect kingdom. You are supposed to rule, yet you hang on a cross. The will of the Father is not completely finished. But Lord, as you hang there, you say it is finished. No one else does. You say it. You hold on just long enough. You have spoken as though you are the one in control. Why is it so difficult for us to see this, Lord? What is coming? What is coming next? What is coming so that this might have to happen? But why now? Why now when there's still so much more to do? It doesn't make any sense. We don't understand. Maybe we just don't understand that this is the way it is supposed to happen. Maybe we've allowed our expectations to create an illusion that was never meant to be created. We have only seen a portion of the picture. It is only what our eyes can see. It is what we have been led to believe. Our eyes have told us that this is not how it should be finished. We don't know. Are we trying to hold on to something that must die? We see you hang there, and yet we really don't know the will of the Father. You have spoken. This time, stage is supposed to end. It must end. It must be completed for some reason. But what, Lord? There is something else. Something that you only know. Show us, Lord. Show us what you mean. Show us what you mean when you say, it is finished. Show us that your work must be completed so that we can move into whatever comes next. As you hold on, Lord, help us hold on. Help us hold on not to the past, but what is to come. Help us to trust you. Strengthen our faith in what you are doing. Strengthen us so that we might experience what is to come next. And strengthen us so that we might be able to live in your glory. Amen.
The seventh word comes from the Gospel of Luke. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. We've come to the end. Jesus' final words on the cross and then his death. As we walk through this Passion Week, we encounter a Jesus who is unfairly accused, subjected to a kangaroo court, humiliated emotionally, and who has endured hours upon hours of physical pain and suffering. As we sat tonight, we walked through Jesus' last moments. He's watched people do what they do, which ultimately meant killing him. He's listened to the plea of a second-rate criminal, begging for mercy. He has watched his own mother, broken-hearted, as she sits at the feet of his cross and watches him die. Burdened by the sin of the world and accepting the forsakenness that comes with that, still ultimately like us, thirsty like us, and finally, ultimately, it is finished. Father,
into your hands I commit my spirit. In the middle of the greatest injustice that has ever been committed against another human being or ever will be committed against another human being, as earth itself shakes, as the sun darkens, as the structure of the temple itself changes and is destroyed, Jesus calls out to his Father in total trust and with complete faith. A completely righteous and innocent man, as even the godless Roman centurion recognizes, dying naked, stuck up on some sticks for everyone to watch. And the last thing that he says before he stops breathing is a word of faith. They are not words of despair, and they are not words of hopelessness. In the end, whether Jesus knew or not what Sunday would bring, he dies in absolute, centered faith in a good God, trusting that even in this darkest moment of all of human history, that God is still his rock and his fortress, and that this God is trustworthy even in, and especially in, a moment when everything looked completely lost. God is trustworthy. God can redeem all things, and if God can be trusted in this moment, God can be trusted in all moments in the midst of hell itself. And I look at this image of Jesus in total faith, and I doubt that my faith would ever be strong enough to stand up under an assault like this. Quite frankly, when my car doesn't start in the morning, or when I haven't had enough time to study for a big test, my faith can barely stand up under that. The good news, the really good news, the gospel news, is that I don't have to. Jesus did. Jesus had the faith that we do not have. Jesus provides the trust that we cannot ever muster for ourselves, even in death. Even in death. Jesus is giving us his faith in the midst of this darkness. Jesus on the cross takes care of the messiest, foulest, most pernicious sin that we can cling to and that we cannot take care of on our own. And Jesus on the cross lives into a deep, deep trust that we can never produce on our own. Jesus on the cross is not our example to follow. Jesus on the cross is our stand-in. The one whose righteousness we cannot emulate and whose trust we cannot imitate died so that we could be wrapped up in his righteousness and faith. Jesus acted for us in faith once and for all.